Podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and where are my notes? What am I doing? I thought I was more prepared for this than I was. Hey, why don't you just restart the intro? No. We're talking about demons this week. Oh, God. Part 3, the third time we've done this in our spooky Halloween months. So 5 more stories of places and people allegedly possessed by demons. We're looking at the stories of George Lukins, Clara Cele, the Enfield Poltergeist, the Demon House, and Emma Schmidt.
Story time. Story time. Story time? Story time.
On May 31st, 1788, Reverend Joseph Easterbrook was summoned by Sarah Barber, who had come across a tailor named George Lukins. At the time, George was running through the streets, singing and screaming in voices that didn't remotely resemble a human voice. And according to Sarah, doctors had long since given up on George, trying to figure out what was wrong with him, and just kind of were just like, yeah, he just needs some kind of spiritual help. 'Cause sure. So the people in Yatton, which I believe is in England, the village where George lived, couldn't understand why George was acting this way. He had always been a good guy. He was constantly attending church and whatnot. But ever since George had participated in a Christmas pageant 18 years before, in which he received a, quote, supernatural slap, whatever that means, he just really hadn't been the same. So after spending 20 weeks in St. George's Hospital, doctors declared him completely incurable, and I guess they let him out. The villagers began to suspect that George had been possessed by a demon, and, they told him, they're like, George, come on, you know what happened here. Ever since you got that slap at the Christmas pageant, I think that just let a demon inside you. And George, he scoffed at such a ridiculous assertion. And instead he insisted that he actually had not been possessed by a demon, but by 7 that could only be driven out by 7 clergymen. On June 13th, so a couple of weeks later, Easterbrook and 6 other clergymen took George to the vestry at Temp Church, where they performed an exorcism. George barked. He sang inverted hymns, which I don't even know what that means. And he lashed out violently at the ministers who were just there trying to help him. However, within hours, the group had used the Trinitarian formula, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And they just said that over and over again to command the demons to return to hell. And eventually, George screamed out, "Blessed Jesus!" And he leapt from the bed, completely demon-free. Of course he did. He recited the Lord's Prayer, which demon-possessed people can't do, obviously. He thanked the Methodist and Anglican ministers who had performed his exorcism, and then just happily went on his merry way just as a normal person. Despite criticism from skeptics accusing George of merely acting like a possessed person for 18 years, George insisted that he had been cured and lived the rest of his life in peace. Maybe. I mean, that would be the longest con though, right? Like, you just have a mental breakdown and you just decide, I'm just gonna pretend to be possessed. And then you just do that for 18 years just to really drive the point home. It's George, it's been over a decade. It's time to drop the ruse. No, you just got to keep going a little bit longer. I don't think everyone's convinced yet. I'm crazy. I'm possessed by the devil. Anyway, 18 years. And no. Anyway, I don't know. My brain stopped there. I was just kind of exploring, and then I hit a dead end and there's nothing there. So I got to kind of back it around, come back out, go into our second story here in 1906. 16-year-old Clara Germana Cele was possessed by a demon while at St. Michael's Mission in Natal, South Africa. She had been orphaned at the mission as an infant, but later decided that it was a good idea to make a pact with the devil. You know how teenagers are. And that's where all of this began. So Clara began speaking languages that she had no previous knowledge of, including Polish, German, and French, all of which are famously not in South Africa. She began revealing the deepest, darkest secrets of the people who were in the room with her during her demonic episodes, which was probably really inconvenient for everybody. You know, just like, Mark sleeps with goats. And Dave over here, he likes little boys. And Margaret, she's the worst of them all. Margaret prefers RC Cola over Coke. Ah! I don't know. That was a dumb joke. That was not my best effort. You get it though. She even, during her episode, she'd even just like Hulk out and would literally pick up the nuns and throw them out of the convent rooms, according to the accounts. Clara's otherworldly screams frightened all of the other nuns in this convent. One nun described them as, quote, a veritable herd of wild beasts orchestrated by Satan that formed a hellish choir. Which, what a word salad that is. What a delectable, just a fantastic construction of a sentence. Good for them. Clara was even reported to have levitated 5 feet, both vertically and horizontally, which I guess maybe she went up 5 and then over 5. I don't know. However, when she was then sprinkled with holy water, she just went back to normal. I hope they did it while she was levitating. Like, she just levitates up out of her bed, floats over the floor, and then the priest is like, holy water, and then she falls to the floor. That would be great. I would do that if I was a priest. Finally, 2 priests, Reverends Mansueti and Reverend Erasmus, were called in to perform the exorcism. At first, Clara tried to knock the Bible out of the priest's hands and even grabbed the stole around his robe and tried to choke him out with it. That's pretty hardcore. But after 2 days, the demon inside of Clara Cele was forced out and she went back to normal. And that's all we have. That's all we know, because Africa, they're not one for follow-ups. So maybe that's what happened. Anyway, our next story here is of Emma Schmidt, who was born on March 23rd, 1882 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Maybe. Those records conflict with details given in the rest of her story. Other historians believe that Emma may have actually been born in Thurgau, Switzerland on July 3rd, 1882. Regardless, whoever Emma was began showing signs of demonic possession as a teenager, including, quote, disturbed thoughts and unspeakable sexual acts, which just sound like normal things that teenagers do, right? How many of us as teenagers had disturbed thoughts and were probably kind of like at least somewhat curious about unspeakable sexual acts, right? You ladies know what I'm talking about. You pick up your mom's erotic novels, maybe not your mom, but like, I don't know, your grandma or that old aunt that's been alone for a little too long, you know, looking through her erotic novels and like, ooh, werewolf having sex with a lady. That seems interesting. Ooh, a merman. I'd like to let a merman sink his fishy little rod into you. What you get, you know, you've been there, right? Probably. You don't act like you haven't. I know you have. You dirty little girl, you. Anyway, they also, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. People also noticed a revulsion. We're going back into the story. A revulsion towards holy objects and an inability to enter churches. And maybe, I don't know. Listen, I've been a teenager. I didn't want to go to church as a teenager. I didn't want to go inside church. Did that mean I was possessed by a demon? No, I was just a teenager and I was stubborn. I just didn't want to go. It was boring. Well, on June 18th, 1912, at age 30, Emma finally underwent an exorcism led by Father Theophilus Reisinger. What a name. Very little is known about this exorcism, and details of Emma's life for the next 16 years after this are sparse. So it must have gone okay. In 1928, though, Reisinger was called back in to perform a second exorcism on Emma. She was taken to a nearby convent in Milwaukee on August 17th, where she hissed like a cat and fell into fits of rage over food that had been sprinkled with holy water. And that sounds like autism. If I'm being honest, you guys, like, you know, those girls, we all had one. We all went to school with a girl who hissed at people for no reason. I did. I remember her very well. Her name was Victoria, and she had like a weird last name. I can't remember what it was, but her name was Victoria. And she was like, she hardcore hissed at people. You just looked at her and it was just, and just all the time. And it's just like, okay, Victoria, chill out. Like, no one's coming closer to you. You smell weird. And it was just like, just all unnecessary hissing to everybody except the teacher. She knew when to cool it. But just, you walk by her, you get too close to her when you're walking the halls by the locker, and just like, whoa, okay, hey, let's calm down. That sounds like this is what, and you just do anything wrong. Just get something weird on her food. It just, it's autism. That's a weird kind of autism, but it's probably autism. I would know. I'm an expert. During this second exorcism, though, Emma reportedly levitated, howled, and then suspended herself from the frame of a doorway. Which, God, I hope they make a movie about this, because that seems pretty hardcore. Over the next 4 months, 2 additional exorcisms lasting a week at a time or more were conducted. By the end of the third exorcism, Emma then refused to eat and often vomited up what appeared to be tobacco leaves. Although her face was constantly swollen, she was still able to fluently speak in several languages that she had previously never known. The sessions were so violent that several nuns in the convent asked to be moved to a new location because they were so traumatized after all of this was over with. Reisinger and other priests soon came to believe that Emma had been possessed by multiple entities, one being Judas Iscariot. They also believed that her father Jacob and her aunt Mina also possessed her. Mina was a local witch who placed spells on herbs for the food she made and was reported to be having an affair with Jacob. Now, Jacob being a father, Mina being an aunt, here's the difference, right? Were Jacob and Mina brother and sister, or was Mina like Jacob's brother's wife, or maybe Jacob's wife's sister, something, or maybe Jacob's wife's sister-in-law? All kinds of aunts here. So we don't really know what that situation was, but we do know, allegedly, that Emma was possessed by the both of them. The priest believed specifically that Jacob's spirit was angry at Emma for refusing his incestuous advances on her when she was younger, before he then eventually moved on to Aunt Mina. So maybe it was his sister. His daughter wouldn't bang him, so maybe his sister would. That's weird. What's going on in Wisconsin where that's what you guys are doing? Anyway, on December 23rd, Reisinger finally commanded all of Emma's demons to leave her and go back to hell. At that point, Emma collapsed on her bed and shrieked, "Beelzebub, Judas, Jacob, Mina, hell, hell, hell." And then moments later, she opened her eyes and in her own voice said, "My Jesus, mercy, praised be Jesus Christ." And that was it. Over the next several years, Emma only exhibited, quote, milder and quite manageable possessions. That's probably just what they called periods. In later written accounts of her exorcisms, Emma's identity was changed to Anna Eklund, but we all know that it's Emma Schmidt now. And so depending on which person was the true Emma, she either died on July 23rd, 1941 at age 59, or on June 23rd, 1964 at age 81. Our next story here is of the Enfield Poltergeist, and it's specifically just about being a single mom. And that's hard. I'm guessing. I have a hard time when Finn is just here by himself for like a couple of hours. I can't imagine how hard it is for my wife, who has to deal with him when I'm at work for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, really. Like, super hard. And it's got to be even more difficult when you have 4 kids instead of just 1. Gotta be Oh, the nightmare, the most worst thing. I don't know what I'm saying. It's terrible. Gotta be terrible. So much respect. I wish we could give all the single moms and single dads out there all of the things, all of the support. Like, because that's hard. That is so crazy hard, especially if you have no idea how to raise a kid. It's probably a little bit easier for my wife because she literally went to college to know how to take care of like babies and small children. I lose my faith in the world immediately. Like as soon as like just any kind of hardship happens, I get so flustered and give up. And that says really more about me as a person than maybe a lot of other things. I got a lot of quit in me, you know. That's the dog I've got in me. My dog just kind of lays down. It is what it is. So in August, we're going back into the story again. In August 1977, Peggy Hodgson called police from her home in Enfield, which is a suburb of London, after 14-year-old daughter Margaret and 11-year-old daughter Janet claimed that along with the moving furniture, they were hearing knocking sounds coming from the walls. The police officer who arrived to investigate noticed that he saw a chair wobble and slide all on its own, but then didn't really do anything about it. Over the next 18 months, more than 30 people, including neighbors, reporters, and paranormal researchers, visited this house and watched as furniture moved across the floor, rocks and toys flew across the room, children were just levitating all by themselves without any help, allegedly. Several people heard knocking noises and an unintelligible, gruff voice coming from the walls. By 1979, however, all of the activity stopped and everybody just kind of let it go. Two of the investigators who visited the house, Maurice Gross and Guy Playfair of the Society of Psychical Research, noted that several of the phenomenons that happened in the house, and they wrote a book titled "This House is Haunted: The True Story of a Poltergeist." Although they felt pretty certain that some sort of entity was causing a couple of the events, they also believed that 11-year-old Janet was kind of behind a lot of it. For example, a secret camera that they had placed in the house caught Janet bending spoons that later appeared in the kitchen drawer, and Gross actually caught her banging a broom handle on the ceiling when they were claiming that they were hearing the knocks coming from the walls. Eventually, both Janet and Margaret confessed that this was all a prank, but Gross and Playfair actually ended up begging them to recant the confession because they had put a ton of time and effort into their book and really wanted all the dingalings in London to believe that ghosts were real. Because the girl's actual confession wasn't enough to let it go, other skeptics chimed in to explain the other events that had happened, such as the levitation and the gruff voice that I mentioned when you so assuredly thought that this was a real poltergeist, right? The only evidence people had of the levitation was a camera that had been set up in their bedrooms that was timed to take a picture every 15 seconds. Janet easily figured this out and timed it perfectly where she would jump off of her bed just as the camera snapped a photo, which is brilliant. This is expert level trolling by this 11-year-old kid, where it's like, oh, this camera is just taking a picture of it. I'm just gonna plank in midair every 15 seconds. And just, God, I love this kid. The deep voice, which only had the vocabulary of an 11-year-old child, was allegedly caused by false vocal cords, which is like the thick folds of mucous membrane just above your vocal cords that are often utilized in making various noises. So it's kind of like if I just started talking like this, like, right? Like that's how she was doing it. Even more, whenever the voice would speak, Janet would just place her hand over her mouth. Why no one ever called her on this is wild. British people are silly. In the end, the entire event was labeled a hoax, and both Gross and Playfair were ridiculed for having been tricked by children. Our final story here is of the Demon House. So in November of 2011, very recent, by the way, LaToya Ammons, her mother Rosa, and her three kids aged 7, 9, and 12 moved into a house in Gary, Indiana, which is often considered one of the worst places to be in America at any given time. Less than a month into her stay, LaToya noticed huge swarms of flies gathering on the porch. Even worse, despite several cans of bug spray and visits by an exterminator, the piles and piles of dead flies were quickly replaced by another living swarm. While LaToya was busy dealing with the flies, Rosa, her mother, often heard footsteps in the basement and the sound of doors creaking when no one was around to touch them. At one point, she looked up to see a, quote, shadowy figure pacing around the living room and later found a boot print that it had allegedly left. On another occasion, Rosa claimed that she was choked out by some unknown force. LaToya's 3 kids were not immune to this either. On one occasion, when her daughter had a friend visiting for a sleepover, LaToya was awoken to the sound of her daughter's friends screaming in terror. And when LaToya ran into the room, she saw her daughter levitating unconscious above her bed with her friend just freaking out. LaToya, Rosa, and everyone else in the house quickly gathered and began praying until their daughter slowly descended back down to the bed and awoke, having no idea what had just happened, allegedly. At that point, LaToya decided to reach out to a clairvoyant who recommended that she build an altar in the basement. And so thinking that was a very reasonable thing to do, LaToya covered a small end table with a white sheet and placed a candle and statues of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus on it. LaToya then opened her Bible to Psalm 91, put on a white t-shirt and a white scarf, and marched through the house reading the psalm and burning sage and sulfur. And just Psalm 91, just kind of like one that's like asking for comfort and protection. It's like, whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So like, sure, it's appropriate. Everything after that seemed fine for the next 3 days, but then the activity quickly came back. All 3 children's eyes began to bulge. Their voices deepened. The youngest child even began talking to a boy in the closet that no one could see. On April 19th, 2012, LaToya reached out to her doctor, Jeffrey Onyukwu, to possibly figure out what was going on. Maybe there was some actual medical episode going on. It's Gary, Indiana. Maybe there's a ton of lead in the water. When the doctor arrived at the house, he noted that everyone was acting delusional and had someone from his office call the police. So when the police arrived, all 3 children were taken to the hospital. Although the oldest 2 were acting normal, the youngest, quote, screamed and thrashed as he was taken out of the house. While at the hospital, LaToya's oldest son was then thrown across the room by some unknown force. During an interview with a nurse, her youngest son's eyes rolled into the back of his head as he growled, "It's time to die. I will kill you." Which that's pretty wild for like a little kid to say. A few minutes later, the nurse then watched this 9-year-old kid walk backwards up the wall to the ceiling, flip over Rosa, and land on his feet. Which that's just breakdancing. They're just getting down. All right. Like, this is 2012. The Motto by Drake featuring Lil Wayne and Tyga was like the #1 song at the time. He's probably just getting down, just a little dancing kid, just, getting down to some Drake, probably in the hospital telling the nurse that he was going to kill her. I don't know. After a brief investigation, the Department of Child Services concluded that the children were just conducting a very elaborate performance for their mother, despite Gary's police captain, Charles Austin, wholly believing that something paranormal was going on because, it's Gary. What else would happen there? 3 days later, LaToya then hired Father Michael Maginot to come perform an exorcism on the house and her children. After concluding that they were, in fact, being tormented by demons, Maginot performed 3 exorcisms, including one directly on LaToya. A few weeks later, LaToya moved her entire family to Indianapolis and has not been tormented since. So obviously, people thought LaToya was full of crap, namely her landlord. Prior and future tenants of this house never reported any sort of paranormal events, and the landlord just kind of believed that LaToya used the excuse of demonic activity as a way to avoid paying rent, which she did not 100% pay. Not at all. In 2014, paranormal investigator and giant douchebag Zach Bagans purchased this home for $35,000 and demolished it 2 years later after filming his documentary, Demon House. The documentary was generally panned. No one believes that any of this was real. The fact that he was able to purchase a home in Gary, Indiana for $35,000 in 2014 just shows how terrible of a place Gary, Indiana is. Here's the thing. Like, LaToya, all this, that's a black family. All right. Black people don't have time to mess around with the paranormal. So, like, if you're going to believe that one of these stories is real, it's this one. All right. All the things that black people have to go through, and they're going to throw in demonic possession on top of that. They don't have time to play for that. But then also Zach Bagans got involved. So, yeah, it's probably not real.
All done.
There we go. Part 3 of Demons in the Books. I really feel like this one, like the first 2, you could probably like find like, oh, that's probably real demon possession. This one, I can't. There's nothing here on this episode. I'm sorry. I know you want to believe that demons are real, but I just can't. I can't not with this batch of evidence. All right, probably not. But let's recap anyway and see what we learned.
What did we learn?
Number 1, George Lukins, Jesus Christ. George Lukins pretended to be possessed by a demon for 18 years, and then he got an exorcism, and he was totally fine. So was he possessed by a demon for 18 years, or did he just want to spend a couple of decades not doing anything and just pretended to be crazy? We will never know. Some of you probably think, no, yeah, it's real demon possession, bro. Whatever, maybe, sure. I don't know. Where's your evidence? Anyway, number 2, Emma Schmidt, possessed by the spirit of her dead father, who was mad that she wouldn't let him get all up in them guts. And so then he had to go get up in his sister's guts. And then his sister was mad about that, and she possessed her too. Maybe. I don't know. What's going on in Wisconsin where incestuous demons are possessing women? That's okay. Number 3, the demon house in Gary, Indiana, tormented a black family and their 3 kids. Then Zach Bagans bought the house and he demolished it because it's too demonic, bro. And he made a documentary about it, and everyone thinks he's full of crap.
What did we learn?
Next week on Our Weird World, it's the final week of October, and we're going to end it with part 6 of some stories about aliens. 5 more alien sighting stories. We are looking at the Flying Men, the Ellsworth sighting, the Kecksburg incident, the Exeter incident, and Lonnie Zamora's tail encounter, whatever you want to say. But it's all about aliens next week. So thank you for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.
This is a podcast.